Number 1. He stood well over 6 feet tall, a physically imposing figure with a quiet demeanor that many found unremarkable. His name was Elias Abuelazam. At the time of his arrest, he was in his early 30s and had worked various jobs in healthcare and retail. Born in the city of Ramla, in what is now Israel, he came to the United States as a child with his family. He spent much of his early life between countries, settling for periods in Virginia before eventually moving to Michigan. Friends and neighbors remembered him as polite, if somewhat distant. His work history included a position as a mental health technician at a behavioral health center in Virginia, and just weeks before the attacks that would bring him to national attention, a short stint working behind the counter at a small market in Beecher, Michigan. There were no clear indications early on that he was capable of violence on a large scale. People who knew him described him as quiet and physically strong, a presence that could easily be overlooked in everyday life. There were hints of instability in his past, a history of run-ins with police over minor incidents, and according to court records, earlier reports of erratic behavior, but nothing that drew widespread attention or suggested what was to come. The summer of 2010 would forever change that perception. Beginning in the late spring of that year, police departments in several states began tracking a pattern of attacks against men walking alone at night. In Genesee County, Michigan, particularly in and around the city of Flint, a task force was formed to investigate a growing series of stabbings. Survivors described a large man driving a green sport utility vehicle who approached them under the pretense of asking for directions or help. In some cases, the encounters escalated. Suddenly, the man would produce a knife and wound his target before driving off. The victims were predominantly small-framed men, many of whom were African American, walking alone late at night. In a span of just a few months, authorities eventually linked 5 deaths and nearly a dozen other stabbing incidents across multiple states, Michigan, Virginia, and Ohio, to the same suspect. Among those killed were men identified in public records as David Motley, Emanuel Abdul Muhammad, Darwin Marshall Frank Kellybrew, and Arnold Miner. While not all of the deaths were prosecuted, law enforcement officials treated the string of attacks as part of one larger pattern that had unsettled multiple communities. Investigators relied heavily on witness descriptions, vehicle sightings, and a composite sketch to narrow their search. Tips eventually pointed to Abuelazam, and on a late summer evening he was located at an airport in Atlanta as he prepared to board a flight bound for Israel. Federal officers detained him on an outstanding warrant. He waived extradition and was returned to Michigan, where he was held in custody. Prosecutors in Michigan moved forward with a murder case tied to the death of Arnold Miner in Flint. At trial, the defense argued that Abuelazam suffered from severe mental illness, presenting testimony that he believed he was controlled by evil forces and citing prior psychological diagnoses. The prosecution countered with expert witnesses who described a carefully orchestrated pattern of actions that did not fit typical criteria for legal insanity. After deliberation, a jury found him guilty of murder, and a judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Though Michigan authorities chose not to pursue separate trials on every alleged attack in other states, later developments saw Abuelazam confess to an additional murder from an earlier case in Virginia under an agreement that granted him immunity for that specific crime. He remains incarcerated and barred from release on his life sentence. In prison, he has been held in segregation for his safety and that of others, and efforts by his legal team to alter his place of detention or challenge his status have not resulted in any reduction of his sentence. Currently, he is serving out that life term with no possibility of conditional release under the jurisdiction that convicted him. Number 2. He was John Eric Armstrong, a man whose public image before his arrest was far removed from the crimes that would eventually define him. Born on November 23, 1973, in New Bern, North Carolina, Armstrong spent his youth in a family marked by hardship and loss. His early years were shaped by his mother's struggles and the death of his younger brother when Armstrong was still a boy. Those experiences left emotional scars that, according to later reports, went largely unaddressed. As a young adult, he joined the United States Navy in the early 1990s, earning an honorable discharge some years later, and earning a reputation among shipmates as moody and reserved. After his military service, Armstrong enrolled in community college and took up life in suburban Michigan, where he lived a life that to outsiders seemed ordinary. Yet beneath that surface was a history of psychological turmoil. Armstrong later claimed that his father had been abusive and that he himself suffered mistreatment in his youth, including sexual abuse. These statements emerged during legal proceedings and interviews with investigators, but they paint only part of a complex picture. Friends and acquaintances remembered him as distant, with bursts of unpredictable behavior that seemed out of step with the rest of his personality. There were reports of his struggles with relationships and emotional stability, though nothing in his public life hinted at the pattern of violence that would come to light years later. Between the early 1990s and the turn of the new century, Armstrong traveled extensively with the Navy and later settled intermittently in Michigan. Law enforcement agencies would eventually link a disturbing series of crimes to him across multiple locations, particularly in Detroit. The victims in these cases were women involved in sex work, individuals whom Armstrong encountered in urban settings where their paths crossed in the course of his everyday movements. Investigators later described a pattern in which he would approach these women and, in several instances, attempt to strangle them. Unlike crimes that seemed impulsive or confined to a single location, these incidents reflected a broad geographic spread that confounded authorities for years. The investigation into the murders that became associated with Armstrong gained momentum in early 2000. In January of that year, officers in Dearborn Heights, Michigan, questioned him after he reported finding a body in a river, claiming to feel sick at the sight. He was not arrested at that time, but the encounter placed him on police radar. Weeks later, in early April, another woman escaped from what she later described as a violent encounter with a man matching Armstrong's description. She fought back and fled, providing investigators with crucial information. Shortly thereafter, another individual survived an attack and was able to identify his assailant. These survivor accounts helped law enforcement build a profile and narrow their focus. On April 12th, 2,000 DNA evidence collected from a homicide victim matched Armstrong's genetic profile, leading to his formal arrest in Michigan. In the days that followed, police uncovered multiple bodies of women who had been strangled and left in outdoor locations. The victims were identified through fingerprint records and interviews with families and acquaintances. The mounting evidence and surviving witness testimony gave investigators the foundation they needed to pursue charges. At his trial in March 2001, Armstrong faced charges related to one of the earliest identified murders. Defense attorneys argued insanity, but the jury rejected that claim, and he was convicted of first-degree murder. Judges later imposed multiple life sentences, reflecting the gravity of his actions and the pattern of offenses uncovered by prosecutors. In subsequent legal proceedings, he was also convicted for additional murders and received further life terms plus extended prison time. Throughout the investigation and trial, media coverage highlighted both the impact on families of the victims and the challenges faced by law enforcement in linking multiple homicides to a single suspect. Public reaction varied from shock to relief once Armstrong was removed from the community and held accountable under the law. Psychological assessments offered differing interpretations of Armstrong's motivations. Some experts noted his early trauma and patterns of anger toward women he perceived as symbolic of past personal rejections. Others stressed that the evidence supported a pattern of predatory behavior that escalated over time. While Armstrong made statements to investigators about his motives, the complexity of his actions defied simple explanation. Today, John Eric Armstrong remains incarcerated under multiple life sentences in the Michigan correctional system, where he continues to serve out the terms imposed by the courts. Number 3. Shelley Andre Brooks was born on January 22, 1969, in Detroit, Michigan. At the time of his arrest in 2006, He was 37 years old, living in the same city where he had spent much of his life. Before the crimes that would lead to his conviction, Brooks was not widely known beyond his neighborhood. He was a man who struggled with employment and stability, often described by acquaintances as quiet and unpredictable, a figure who did not attract much attention in ordinary social settings. Though he grew up in the heart of Detroit, his childhood was marked by emotional fragmentation. His mother left the family when he was very young, and his father was reportedly neglectful. This early abandonment placed him in the care of his grandparents in Ann Arbor, where, according to later reports, he carried a deep resentment toward his mother and displayed early signs of emotional distress that never fully resolved. Brooks's upbringing left lasting psychological scars. Friends and neighbors recalled that he struggled academically and socially, and that he exhibited frustration and anger that sometimes flared without clear cause. There were periods when he fell in and out of work, and other times when he appeared isolated, drifting through Detroit's neighborhoods, rather than forming stable community ties. Mental health evaluations after his arrest referenced a history of low cognitive functioning and unresolved trauma, though there was no formal institutional diagnosis publicly noted before his crimes came to light. Beginning in 2001 and continuing through 2006, a troubling pattern emerged across parts of Detroit's East Side. Middle-aged women who were vulnerable due to homelessness addiction or involvement in sex work began turning up dead in deserted places, abandoned apartment buildings, vacant lots alleys, and unused garages. 7 women would later be tied to one perpetrator. They included Sandra Davis, age 54, Pamela Greer, age 33, Marion Woods Daniels, age 36, Rhonda Miles, age 45, Thelma Johnson, age 30, Melissa Toston, age 38, and an unidentified woman found in 2006 who was only recently identified as Darrell N. Washington, following advances in DNA technology nearly 2 decades later. While investigators referred to these deaths collectively, the established connections came through DNA evidence, witness descriptions, and Brooks's eventual arrest. Police described a pattern in which Brooks paid the women for sex, and then in several cases inflicted fatal injuries during encounters that began as an exchange and escalated rapidly. Survivors of certain attacks reported that Brooks became violent after interactions they perceived as refusals or confrontations, displaying sudden anger and aggression before leaving the scene. The remoteness of the sites where the victims were found reflected a disturbing effort to separate these crimes from public view. The investigation advanced significantly on June 26, 2006, when Brooks was arrested after being accused of sexually assaulting a woman. At that time, his DNA was collected and quickly matched samples from one of the earlier crime scenes linked to the death of Pamela Greer. From this breakthrough, detectives were able to tie Brooks to additional victims and build a case that connected him to multiple homicides spanning 5 years. In 2007, Brooks went to trial in Wayne County, Michigan, on charges related to the deaths of at least 2 women. Prosecutors presented DNA evidence and other incriminating material tying him to those cases. Brooks took the witness stand in his own defense and denied involvement, but jurors did not find his testimony credible. On March 27, 2007, he was convicted of first-degree murder and related charges. Judges sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a term reflecting the weight of evidence and the severity of the offenses. Experts examining Brooks's motives noted a complex interplay of unresolved trauma hostility toward women he viewed as vulnerable and a personal history marked by abandonment and isolation. While he never provided a clear, consistent explanation for his actions, his own statements to law enforcement and patterns observed by psychologists suggested long-standing anger and psychological disturbance that erupted in violent encounters. Today, Shelley Andre Brooks is serving multiple life sentences at a Michigan correctional facility where he remains incarcerated with no possibility of release under the terms imposed by the courts. Number 4. He was born John Norman Chapman on June 17, 1947, in Windsor, Ontario, and later moved with his family to southeastern Michigan. By the time he was arrested in late July of 1969, he had become known to some of his peers as John Norman Collins, a name he adopted while living in the United States. At the time of his arrest, he was 22 years old, a college student studying elementary education, and an athlete who had once been involved in high school football. To those around him, Collins appeared outwardly ordinary, polite, clean-cut, and well-liked by classmates and neighbors in the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti communities. Before the crimes that would later define his name in criminal history, his public image was that of a young man with academic aspirations and no overt sign of the dark chapter ahead. Yet beneath that facade were lingering psychological pressures and social contradictions that would later attract scrutiny. Accounts from people who knew him during that period described a person capable of being charming one moment and moody the next. Friends sometimes observed bursts of intensity or anger that lay beneath his otherwise calm demeanor. Those who studied his background noted that he had struggled with academic goals, falling short of finishing his degree at Eastern Michigan University and shifting between social circles without finding a consistent anchor. These factors, combined with a broader atmosphere of upheaval in the late 1960s, contributed to a profile of a young man wrestling with unresolved inner conflict and a growing tension between outward normalcy and hidden impulses. Between the summers of 1967 and 1969, a series of violent attacks unfolded within the Washtenaw County area of Michigan, centered around the college towns of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. In that span of time, 8 young females, many of them students or college-age residents, disappeared or were found dead under troubling circumstances. The known victims included Mary Flezer, age 19, Joan Schell, age 20, Marilyn Skelton, age 16, Dawn Bazem, age 13, Karen Sue Beinman, age 18, Alice Calum, age 23, and Roxy Phillips, age 17, along with one other unidentified young woman. Authorities and historians later referred to these cases collectively as the Michigan murders, and the person believed to be responsible became known locally as the Ypsilanti Ripper or the co-ed killer. These crimes shared a pattern that alarmed local law enforcement and the community. Young women walking alone or known to be in the area late at night would go missing, and in many cases their bodies were discovered in isolated locations within a short radius of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. Investigators found that the victims had been subjected to assault and left in conditions suggesting the attacks were methodical and repeated. While the specific methods varied, the pattern of targeting vulnerable young women became clear to detectives who struggled for years to link the separate incidents. The investigation into these murders was long and complex. For more than 2 years, local police, state troopers, and university security searched for leads. Progress was slow, and there were many frustrations and false leads along the way. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people and followed countless tips with little success. Public fear grew as each new case emerged, and pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies to find the person responsible. In July of 1969, a break in the case came shortly after the disappearance of Karen Sue Beineman, an Eastern Michigan University student last seen alive on July 23rd. Within days, authorities identified Collins as a suspect and arrested him on July 30th, 1969. At his trial, prosecutors focused on evidence tying Collins to the last known victim, Beineman. Witnesses placed him with her shortly before she vanished, and additional physical evidence linked him to her murder. The defense attempted to challenge the connections, but the jury found Collins guilty of first-degree murder on August 19, 1970. While he was never tried for the other murders attributed to the Michigan murderer, investigators and historians widely believe he was responsible for the full series of killings that terrorized the community over those 3 years. Psychological assessments offered differing interpretations of Collins's motivations. Some experts described elements of lust, power, and control in his actions, while others pointed to unresolved psychological turmoil masked by his outward appearance of normalcy. Though the full explanation for his behavior remains debated among researchers and historians, the pattern of repeated predatory acts underscores a complex interplay between personal instability and violent impulse. John Norman Collins was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years, and he remains incarcerated in the Michigan correctional system serving out that sentence. Number 5. Rodrick Shonte Dantzler was born on March 8, 1977, in the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. At the time of the shootings that would define the final chapter of his life, he was 34 years old and worked as a building technician. Before the events of July 7, 2011, Dantzler's life had a history marked by instability and troubled relationships. Friends and acquaintances described him as volatile, someone who could be calm in one moment and destructive in another. Growing up without his biological father, he was raised by his mother and stepfather, the latter of whom struggled with substance abuse. Dantzler's early years were punctuated with difficulty, and by his mid-teens he had already encountered the criminal justice system for burglary as a juvenile. In his late teens and early 20s, he amassed a series of convictions, including domestic violence and assault, and he served a term in prison where he worked toward earning his high school equivalency. After his release, he drifted in and out of work and relationships, and those who knew him later said he exhibited signs of anger and emotional instability. By July of 2011, Dantzler's personal life was unraveling. His marriage to Jennifer Heron was ending, and the couple's daughter Camry was living separately with her mother. Friends and family reported that Dantzler had been abusing cocaine and alcohol in the weeks leading up to the shootings. Records show a pattern of escalating conflict in his personal relationships, including past protective orders filed against him by women who said he had threatened them. In the week before July 7th, Jennifer Heron had moved out of their shared home and was planning a permanent separation. On that afternoon, shortly after 2:30 in the afternoon, his mother received a distressing phone call from her son, in which he said he had shot his wife. Police responded to the report, but Dantzler was not at the scene when they arrived. What unfolded next would become one of the deadliest days in Grand Rapids history. Dantzler traveled to 2 separate homes in his hometown, armed with a 9mm handgun. At a residence on Brinell Court, he shot and killed his estranged wife, Jennifer, age 29, their daughter Camry, age 12, and Jennifer's parents, Thomas Heron, age 51, and Rebecca Heron, age 52. Later, at a home on Plainfield Avenue, he fatally shot his former girlfriend, Kimberly Emkins, age 23, along with her sister Amanda, age 27, and Amanda's daughter Marissa, age 10. According to authorities, these victims included people with whom Dantzler had personal relationships, suggesting that his actions were tied to his emotional state and conflicts with those close to him that day. As police discovered the 2 scenes and identified a suspect, the community was plunged into shock. Calls from neighbors and relatives led officers to search for Dantzler throughout the city. At one point during the pursuit, he fired shots at motorists while driving, wounding 2 people who were later treated for minor injuries. Police engaged in a high-speed chase through downtown Grand Rapids and exchanged fire with him, ultimately forcing his vehicle off the road. Rather than surrender, Dantzler ran on foot into a nearby house on Rickman Avenue, where he took 3 people hostage. Officers surrounded the residence, initiating an 8-hour standoff. Negotiations with Dantzler continued into the night, but before they could secure his peaceful surrender, he took his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The hostages were unharmed when the standoff ended. Public reaction was immediate and profound. Law enforcement officials emphasized the rarity of such a violent event in Grand Rapids and the deep sorrow felt across the community. Vigils and memorials were organized in the days that followed, with hundreds of residents gathering to honor the lives lost and support the families of the victims. Officials noted that the tragedy resonated beyond the city as a stark example of how unresolved personal turmoil can erupt into devastating consequences. Psychological interpretations of Dantzler's behavior pointed to a combination of unresolved emotional trauma, substance abuse, and acute distress tied to his failing relationships. While no formal clinical diagnosis was publicly confirmed in the immediate wake of the shootings, police described him as mentally unstable and noted that long-standing personal conflicts may have driven his actions that day. Rodrick Shonte Dantzler died by suicide at the scene of the hostage standoff on the night of July 7, 2011, bringing to an end the sequence of events that claimed 7 lives in Grand Rapids. Number 6. Raymond Martinez Fernandez was born on December 17, 1914, in the territory of Hawaii, to Spanish immigrant parents. At various points in his life, he lived in Connecticut, and later in Spain, where he married and fathered children before ultimately drifting back to the United States after the Second World War. By the time of his arrest on February 28, 1949, Fernandez was 34 years old, known to law enforcement as a confidence trickster and drifter who survived by charming and manipulating others. Before the crimes that brought him lasting notoriety, he worked intermittently in odd jobs and spent periods in prison for petty theft and confidence schemes. To those who encountered him socially, he appeared affable and witty, able to make conversation with strangers in ways that masked the instability beneath his surface. Fernandez's early life was shaped by fractured family ties and a series of setbacks that seemed to ripple through his adult years. During the Second World War, he served in the Spanish Merchant Marine and reportedly provided intelligence to British forces. But a serious head injury suffered on a ship altered both his physical appearance and behavior. After that accident, he developed chronic headaches and, according to some accounts, became increasingly impulsive and erratic. Released from the hospital and back in the United States, he soon found himself in trouble with the law for robbery, and while incarcerated, he was introduced to occult practices by a cellmate. Some observers later suggested that this exposure fed a developing belief in his own power to manipulate women, reinforcing a pattern of exploitation that would grow more dangerous over time. What became known as the Lonely Hearts crimes unfolded between the late 1940s and 1949, as Fernandez met women through personal advertisements in newspapers, the era's equivalent of dating profiles. These Lonely Hearts columns were places where singles sought companionship, but Fernandez saw them as opportunities. Often posing as a widowed or emotionally available man, he would write to women seeking love or friendship, gain their trust, and then exploit their hospitality and financial resources. Initially, the scheme focused on conning these women out of savings and valuables, but it soon escalated beyond simple theft. Fernandez's path crossed with that of Martha Jewel Beck, a nurse from Florida who became more than just a target of his schemes. When Beck answered his letter and they met in person, Fernandez's original plan to deceive her shifted as they formed an unusual bond. Beck, who had 2 children of her own and a history of emotional struggles, became his accomplice. Posing as siblings as they traveled across states like Michigan and New York, the pair continued to answer Lonely Hearts ads together. In some cases, they persuaded the women to share their lives and homes, only to betray the trust they had cultivated. The victims of the Lonely Hearts killer included widows and single women whose only mistake was answering an ad in hopes of connection. Among the known names associated with the crimes were Myrtle Young, Janet Fay, and Delphine Downing, and her young daughter. In several documented cases, relationships that began with courtesies and conversation ended in death and deception, with Fernandez and Beck taking the victims' resources and concealing evidence in ways that temporarily stymied investigators. Police began to close in on Fernandez and Beck after neighbors reported unusual activity at a home in Michigan where Downing and her daughter lived. Officers discovered the victims and through forensic evidence and interviews connected the couple to multiple disappearances and deaths. Fernandez initially confessed to as many as 17 murders, though both he and Beck later recanted parts of that confession, claiming various motives including protecting one another. Law enforcement suspected they might have claimed more victims than could be conclusively linked, but the scale of the suspected killings was enough to alarm authorities and the public. Extradited to New York, because that state still carried the death penalty, Fernandez and Beck stood trial for the murder of Janet Fay. Despite attempts to plead insanity, the jury convicted them of first-degree murder. On March 8, 1951, both were executed by electrocution at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. Their case remembered as one of the most notorious criminal partnerships of the era captured widespread media attention and later inspired films and television portrayals that explored the psychological and social dynamics behind their crimes. Number 7. Gregory Green was born in 1966 and spent much of his life in Dearborn Heights in Wayne County, Michigan. At the time of his second arrest in September of 2016, he was 50 years old and worked in maintenance jobs, though his employment history was punctuated by periods of incarceration and conflict with the law. To those who knew him before the crimes, he was a quiet man who kept largely to himself, blending into the suburban landscape without attracting strong attention. His early life was not widely reported, but community members later described a history of turbulent relationships and unresolved anger that simmered beneath a surface many mistook for calm or indifference. The psychological background that preceded Gregory Green's crimes was shaped by cycles of domestic violence and instability. In July of 1991, early in his adult life, he stabbed his first wife, Tanya Green, who was 6 months pregnant at the time. After the attack, he called the police and waited for them to arrive, confessing without resistance. He pleaded no contest to second-degree murder and was sentenced to a term of imprisonment ranging between 15 and 25 years. Released on parole in 2008 after 16 years behind bars, Green entered back into society with a record that foreshadowed deeper issues of emotional instability and unresolved conflict. While incarcerated, he participated in some rehabilitative programs, but critics later said that these efforts did not address the underlying anger and patterns of possessiveness that marked his earlier behavior. After his release, Green's personal life took a new course. He reconnected with a woman named Faith, whom he had known years earlier. Their relationship moved quickly, and they married not long after his release. Faith brought children from a previous relationship into the marriage, and together they had 2 daughters, Kaylee and Coy Green, who were 4 and 5 years old at the time of the second tragedy. To the community, the family appeared typical at first, though neighbors later recalled disputes behind closed doors and moments of tension that hinted at deeper unresolved issues. On the morning of September 21, 2016, those unresolved tensions erupted in a second violent episode that would again thrust Green into the center of a tragedy that shook Dearborn Heights. Shortly after 1:15 in the morning, a 911 call alerted authorities that a man standing on his front porch was ready to surrender after killing his family. When officers arrived, Green was taken into custody without resistance. Inside the home, investigators found his 2 young biological daughters, 5-year-old Coy and 4-year-old Kaylee, who had died from carbon monoxide exposure in a parked vehicle that had been rigged in the garage. In the basement, his stepchildren, 19-year-old Chadney Allen and 17-year-old Kara Allen, had been shot. Their mother Faith was found alive, but seriously injured, bound, and wounded from separate attacks inside the home. Law enforcement described the entire sequence as an act of domestic violence rooted in revenge and emotional breakdown. Prosecutors noted that Faith had filed for divorce in the months leading up to the incident and had sought legal protection due to ongoing conflict in the marriage. On arriving at the scene and securing Green's arrest, police described an atmosphere of calculated and escalating behavior rather than a spontaneous outburst. In early 2017, Green pleaded guilty in Wayne County Circuit Court to multiple charges, including second-degree murder torture, assault with intent to do great bodily harm, and felony firearm violations related to the deaths of his 4 children, and attack on his wife. At his sentencing hearing in March, Judge Diane Hathaway described the case as among the most tragic the court had encountered, noting the profound breach of familial trust inherent in his actions. Green received a sentence of 45 to 100 years for murder, with additional consecutive terms for the other charges effectively ensuring that he would be in his late 90s before becoming eligible for parole. Psychological assessments presented during pre-trial proceedings described Green's actions as reflective of long-standing emotional volatility, unresolved anger toward intimate partners, and a pattern of possessive behavior that escalated when faced with separation. Though the courts did not release detailed clinical evaluations, testimony from family neighbors and professionals portrayed a man who struggled to cope with rejection and conflict, ultimately allowing those impulses to overwhelm reason and restraint. Gregory Green is currently serving his sentence in a Michigan correctional facility and is projected to remain incarcerated until at least his late 90s before he could be eligible for release. Number 8. Reco G. Jones was born on February 9, 1975, and by the late summer of 1997 he was 22 years old. At the time of the crime that would define his life, he had worked various jobs in Detroit, Michigan, though none offered much stability. Those who encountered him described a young man whose emotional life was marked by tension and unresolved conflict, particularly in his romantic relationships. To the outside world, he did not stand out as someone likely to become the center of a major criminal investigation, and before the tragedy that unfolded on a hot August day, friends and neighbors remembered him as quiet but unpredictable. Jones's background was shaped by a series of unstable relationships and repeated clashes with authority. In the months leading up to the incident, he was involved with several women, including Yolanda Bellamy, a 24-year-old, with whom he had a turbulent and on-again, off-again relationship. Friends from that period said that Jones often expressed intense feelings toward Bellamy, alternating between affection and anger. There were signs of escalating emotional volatility arguments over fidelity resentment when Bellamy began to detach from the relationship and lingering frustration after previous disputes. These tensions would foreshadow the tragic events that followed. On the afternoon of August 13, 1997, police were called to a home in Detroit after relatives could not reach the occupants. Inside, law enforcement found the bodies of Bellamy, her two young sons, Nathan Burns Jr., age 5, and Nathan Burns III, age 3, and her niece and nephew, Shonte, age 3, and Delvante Bellamy, age 5. Each of the victims had suffered fatal injuries from repeated stabbing. Investigators later described the scene as the site of one of the most devastating family homicides Detroit had seen in years, a moment that echoed through the community in shock and grief. The path to that moment began the day before. Prosecutors later told the court that Bellamy had ended her relationship with Jones and told him she intended to have an abortion. Though that claim was later shown to be untrue, it struck a chord with Jones and heightened the emotional tension between them. Neighbors reported hearing arguing from the home in the hours before the tragedy, and later law enforcement would document evidence of struggle inside the residence. Police identified Jones as a suspect later that same day. He was arrested that afternoon and taken into custody without resistance, though he displayed signs of emotional disorientation. During the early stages of questioning, Jones made contradictory statements, at times accusing others of the murders, and at other times admitting he had helped clean up the scene. In a dramatic moment the day after his arrest, Jones attempted to escape by jumping from a 5th-floor window at police headquarters, suffering significant injuries. He survived the fall and was returned to custody. As the case proceeded to trial in Wayne County, Circuit Court prosecutors painted a portrait of a man consumed by rage and incapable of coping with rejection. The prosecution argued that Jones's actions were rooted in intense emotional disturbance triggered by the breakup, and his belief, however mistaken, that Bellamy was ending their relationship and planning to terminate a pregnancy. Defense attorneys explored alternative theories at times, suggesting someone else may have been involved, but the jury found the evidence against Jones compelling. After deliberating for several hours, jurors convicted Jones on 5 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Bellamy and the 4 children. The conviction reflected the jury's conclusion that his actions were premeditated and that he had acted deliberately in carrying out the killings. In April of 1998, Wayne County Circuit Judge Kim Worthy sentenced Jones to 5 concurrent life terms in prison, without the possibility of parole, 1 for each life taken. Psychological assessments presented during sentencing and in later reflections by professionals highlighted Jones's intense emotional dependence, unresolved anger, and inability to process loss and rejection in healthy ways. While definitive clinical diagnoses were not publicly released, observers noted patterns of instability and fixation that may have contributed to his actions on that August day. Reco G. Jones is currently serving his sentence in a Michigan correctional facility under the terms imposed by the Wayne County Court. Number 9. Matthew Emanuel Macon was born on September 8, 1979, in Lansing, Michigan. When he was arrested on August 28, 2007, Macon was 27 years old and living in the capital region of Michigan, known as Mid-Michigan. Before the events that would alter his life and grip the local community with fear, Macon's life included a troubled childhood, multiple entries into the criminal justice system, and a reputation among law enforcement as someone with an extensive record of assaults and other offenses. Friends from his youth recalled a boy who struggled emotionally and socially, spending time in foster care and juvenile facilities, and then cycling between confinement and brief periods of freedom as an adult. In social settings, he was usually quiet and kept to himself, not drawing much attention, but his history suggested unresolved conflict and instability that would foreshadow what came next. Macon's psychological background was marked by long-standing challenges, including early contact with the criminal justice system. As a teenager, he was repeatedly involved in juvenile detention, and as an adult, he spent significant stretches in prison for a range of offenses, including assault and larceny. His intermittent periods of release were punctuated by further arrests, indicating a pattern of impulsive and violent behavior. Those who worked with him in corrections described a man who struggled to control his anger, and impulses, though formal psychological diagnoses, were not publicly released at the time of his crimes. This pattern of emotional instability, combined with a life of repeated institutionalization, created circumstances that some experts later interpreted as risk factors for escalating violence. Between the summers of 2007 and the day of his arrest, Lansing, Michigan was shaken by a series of violent attacks on women. Within just over 4 weeks, 5 women were beaten to death, and a 6th woman survived an attack that left police certain they were facing a serial offender. The victims were independent adult women with no known connection to one another, whom Macon targeted in isolated settings across the city's neighborhoods. The first attack that drew sustained police attention was the beating of 76-year-old Ruth Hallman, a well-known community advocate in her neighborhood, who lived alone and had spent decades supporting her neighbors. When first responders arrived, Hallman was conscious but unable to fully explain what had happened. She died 2 days later from her injuries. Neighbors and local leaders remembered her as a steadfast figure in her community, someone who devoted time helping others rather than seeking attention for herself. Days later, 36-year-old Deborah Cook was found beaten in a public park, followed shortly thereafter by the discovery of the body of 46-year-old Deborah Renforce in her apartment. Within the same month, 2 more women, 64-year-old Sandra Eichhorn and 41-year-old Karen Delgado Yates, were also found dead in separate locations after suffering similar assaults. There were no clear personal links between these victims and Macon, beyond the fact that he encountered them in everyday circumstances. In some cases, he approached them offering to do small jobs or asking for casual conversation before the attacks. At least one woman, later identified as Linda Chappell Jackson, survived an assault and provided key information to law enforcement after Macon retreated when startled by her dog. As the pattern of killings unfolded, Lansing police joined forces with the Michigan State Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to investigate these seemingly random, yet similarly executed attacks. Detectives developed a task force to pool resources and build a profile of the unknown suspect. After the surviving victim's report and other investigative leads, law enforcement identified Macon as a person of interest. When officers located and arrested him on August the 28th, Macon eventually confessed to police that he had murdered 6 people, identifying several victims by name in recorded interviews. His admissions also included details tying him to a separate homicide dating back to 2004 that investigators had not previously connected to the killings that summer. At trial, prosecutors focused on the killings that occurred during that summer and the assault on the surviving victim. Macon was convicted on multiple charges, including first-degree murder and assault with intent to commit murder. On June 18, 2008, a jury sentenced him to 2 terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring he will remain in custody permanently under Michigan law. Macon's incarceration at the state's Gus Harrison Correctional Facility reflects the gravity of his crimes and the weight of evidence presented at trial. Psychological interpretations of Macon's motivations point to a complex mix of unresolved emotional instability, repeated institutionalization, and relationship difficulties. While law enforcement and experts have noted elements of the killer's statements suggesting a desire for control and domination, they have also observed that his history lacked consistent coping mechanisms for stress or rejection. This interplay of personal history and escalating violence was reflected both in his actions and in the months leading up to his arrest. Matthew Emanuel Macon is currently serving his life sentences at the Gus Harrison Correctional Facility in Michigan, with no possibility of conditional release. Number 10. Carl Eugene Watts was born on November 7, 1953, in Killeen, Texas, and would later become one of the most notorious figures in American criminal history. By the time of his arrest on May 23, 1982, Watts was 28 years old and had spent much of his young adult life drifting between Michigan and Texas. Before his crimes came to light, he seemed to lead a relatively ordinary life on the surface. He attended high school in Michigan, graduated, and even received a college football scholarship, though that opportunity ended abruptly amid allegations of harassment and violence. Those around him recalled a man who could appear charming and athletic one moment and withdrawn or unpredictable the next. There were early signs of troubling behavior conflicts with peers, brushes with the law for stalking, and later arrests for assault, but none of these incidents fully hinted at the scale of what was to come. Watts's psychological and situational background hinted at unresolved internal struggles. According to some accounts, he suffered meningitis as a child, which family members said changed his personality and emotional regulation. He also had a history of stalking and aggression toward women dating back to his teens, long before law enforcement had the evidence to link him to more serious offenses. Friends and associates later said Watts exhibited a fascination with violence and control that he kept hidden beneath a calm exterior. Those early instincts, paired with a lack of meaningful psychological intervention, created conditions that allowed violent impulses to grow unchecked over nearly a decade. Between 1974 and 1982, a troubling pattern of attacks on women unfolded across Michigan and Texas. Watts became known to law enforcement as the Sunday morning slasher because many of the attacks occurred in the early hours of Sunday, often near residential apartment complexes. Authorities eventually confirmed his involvement in numerous cases with his victims, ranging in age from teenagers to women in their early 40s. The methods Watts used varied from one case to another and included stabbing, strangulation, and in some instances, drowning. Unlike some offenders whose crimes show a consistent signature, Watts's actions appeared unpredictable in method, making it difficult for investigators to link individual cases at first. Law enforcement agencies in Michigan began to notice similarities in the attacks over time, particularly in cities such as Ann Arbor, Detroit, and their suburbs, where several young women were found murdered in similar circumstances. Despite growing concern, investigators struggled for years to gather enough evidence to make an arrest. Watts was asked about some early suspicions, but without physical evidence or a direct link to individual cases, detectives could not hold him. It was not until May 1982 that his activities came to an abrupt halt. Watts was apprehended in Houston, Texas, when he assaulted 2 women inside an apartment. One of the women survived and escaped, leading police straight to him. Faced with overwhelming suspicion across multiple jurisdictions, Watts negotiated a controversial plea agreement in Texas. In exchange for providing details and confessions to a number of previously unsolved murders, he pled guilty to burglary with intent to commit murder and accepted a sentence of 60 years in prison. Because of legal technicalities, that sentence was later reduced, and Watts might have become eligible for release years earlier than prosecutors expected. This possibility prompted renewed efforts in Michigan to bring him to trial on murder charges. In the early 2000s, aided by eyewitness testimony that connected him to the 1979 killing of Helen Dutcher in Ferndale, Michigan, authorities charged Watts with murder. In November 2004, and again in 2007, juries convicted him of first-degree murder in Michigan and imposed life sentences without the possibility of parole. Watts spent his final years incarcerated in the Michigan correctional system, where he continued to face scrutiny over the true extent of his crimes. Investigators and experts believe he was responsible for many more deaths than those he confessed to, potentially making him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. Carl Eugene Watts died in prison on September 21, 2007, while serving multiple life sentences at the Ionia Maximum Correctional Facility in Michigan.